Hey guys, before we get into the video, I just want to make a quick little note here. I'm so sorry about the scratchy audio that happens in the intro of the video. I promise it's just in the intro. I had microphone issues that I've spent days now trying to fix in post and was kind of successful, but not entirely. So if minorly scratchy audio bothers you a lot, just go ahead and skip past the intro. If not, thank you for being understanding. It is what it is. Thank you so much for being patient, and now back to the video. George Gordon Byron was a mess, and everybody loved it or loved to hate it. Outrageously handsome, allegedly mad, furiously bisexual, undeniably talented, and simultaneously a scoundrel of historic proportions, Lord Byron spent his absurdly short life causing chaos that rivals even today's influencers. Were he alive today, I'm sure he'd give us the most legendary YouTube apology video of all time. Hey guys, I'm sorry to whoever I offended when I did whatever it is you're upset about. You have no idea how hard it is being this rakishly handsome. Everyone desires you carnally. Everyone hates you carnally. This is the great burden that I bear. Anyway, I'll be back next week. Subscribe to my Patreon. There's a funny little thing that I run into a lot as someone who researches queer history. Time and again, either after or just before the death of a person who was queer or suspectedly so, their personal incriminating letters, diaries, and other writings are hurriedly buried by their family or loved ones. Of course, this wasn't just a thing that happened with queer historical figures, but it's common enough in this realm of study to be, well, a piece of damning evidence in the timeline. Lord Byron was no different, and much like the rest of his scandalous life, the ceremonial burning of his memoirs on May 17, 1824 was a dramatic and morose affair. Byron's life had been extremely short but action-packed, and this, in addition to his well-known somewhat androgynous beauty, only lent power to his legend. As Fiona McCarthy writes in Byron, Life and Legend, Byron's ambiguity of appearance and character was evident to many contemporaries who noted the particular turn of the neck, the almost translucent alabaster skin, the melting character of his prominent eyes, frequently observed in females said to be proof of extreme sensibility. To Lady Blessington, Byron's voice and accent were peculiarly agreeable, but effeminate. His friends agreed there was a great deal of the woman about Byron. When we look at Lord Byron and his legacy of Dionysian chaos, madness, and perhaps genius, it only really starts to make sense when you place him in his own specific context. The Romantic era and Byron are equally informed by each other, and it was a time when great intellect and great insanity were both delicately linked and were often explored through deviating from sexual and gender norms. But Byron, of course, always went so much further, and that makes him a perfect example of the absurdity of queer history. Lord Byron is a national icon in the UK and Greece, for better or for worse, but he was also very, very open about his bisexuality in life, to his friends and family at least, which obviously led to it becoming an internationally known trait. It wasn't tame bisexuality either, trust me. He had bizarre attitudes towards women, engaged in incest, and had a fixation on adolescent boys, inspired by his love of Greek classics. There's hardly anything about Byron outside of his poetry and his later revolutionary leanings that has the makings of a national icon, but he became one nevertheless. And as a result, we have a century and a half's work of Lord Byron academia that blatantly tries to sanitize him, or at the very least, conceal his sexuality. Only fairly recently has this sort of been amended, and scholarly work been done to genuinely analyze him in all of his truths and his flaws. Byron is the epitome of the Romantic era for good reason. He is complex, entertaining, and generally a train wreck. You can't look away, and his life and work set the scene for future queer train wrecks like Oscar Wilde. Echoes of Lord Byron's influence are everywhere despite his comparably short life. What all happened that made him such a legend, for better or for worse? come learn with me. Side note, if you hear bagpipes or talking in the background, that is a failure of the location I'm filming in right now. I'm directly on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and there is a bagpipe guy who is posted right outside the window, and he only stops playing like somewhat every once in a while, so you know what? It adds to the ambiance. And also, this month's channel charity. This month I have chosen the Point Foundation, an organization that helps fund scholarships and support for LGBTQ youth. As stated on their website, Point provides financial support, leadership training, mentoring, and community to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ college students from around the world attending US accredited educational institutions. In order to, I guess, in some ways honor Lord Byron's memory, I think it's great to spotlight a charity that focuses on helping queer youth in the arts and in education. And so I have made a donation, and if you have the means, I really hope that you do too. But before we get into learning, a quick word from today's sponsor, Symphony of the Sojourn by Rowan Alexandria Bennett. This book, I can't stress enough how much I enjoyed reading it, and I actually really often struggle to get invested in high fantasy books. And I didn't have that issue here, which is really impressive. It's a tabletop roleplay game inspired tale that draws inspiration from the format of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So you've got this unlikely alliance of characters, from rogues to wizards, who join together to hunt for the legendary treasure of the mysterious Captain Silver Acheron. Of course, I won't spoil how the journey ends, but what made this book so interesting was the format, where each character of the party takes turns relating their point of view of the adventure, so with each new perspective you gain more insight and a fascinatingly rounded view, not only of the story, but the unique world that it inhabits. I started playing D&D for the first time fairly recently, so of course it immediately drew me in that regard. But even better were all the real-life history references that were sprinkled in. For example, one of the main characters is Julie de Maupin, an obvious reference to the famous French swordswoman and opera singer Julie d'Aubigny La Maupin, which of course had me whooping and hollering like it's the Super Bowl because I did a video on her. So the witty banter between the characters and the heartfelt relationships between these adventurers set against the political intrigue of the fantastical Sojourn Sea makes for a really fun read that reminds me of the same sort of thrill that I felt as a kid watching Treasure Planet, but this time with a more mature tone. Obviously, if you love that movie, D&D, historical fiction style adventure, and the Canterbury Tales, this is absolutely the book for you. You can learn more about the author Rowan Bennett at rowanbennett.com, and you can head over to the link in the description below to order your copy of Symphony of the Sojourn. Thank you so much to this great book for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about that scoundrel Lord Byron. Lord freaking Byron was born in a way that really understates the drama king he would later become. Or maybe it was actually a perfect setting for a tragic backstory by nobility's standards. He entered the world on January 22nd, 1788 in a rental flat at 16 Hall Street, and he was born to Catherine Gordon and Captain John Byron, who had previously been married to a wealthy woman named Amelia, with whom he had a daughter named Augusta, who George Gordon Byron would go on to have an affair with. So yeah, the romantic drama was inherently in his blood. John Byron led a messy life of debt and quarrels, and when he died in George's infancy, he left the young child with all of his debts, a thing that would haunt Byron, but also give him a tragic backstory to hold on to. He fixated on their similarities as an explanation to his own madness, their beauty, their riz, and their tendency to be incestuous. Also notably, Byron was maternally related to King James VI and I, who I will be doing a video about soon. A king who was also extremely gay, so. But Byron's childhood struggles didn't end with his father's debts. When his mother took him to live in Aberdeen, Scotland, she became increasingly volatile and abusive, causing Byron to develop an anxiety disorder and chronic headaches. He had a foot deformity that caused him constant pain and issues walking his whole life. And to make matters worse, his mother had by then lost her wealth. Seemingly alone in the grey, wet, cold Scottish landscape, Byron became haunted by the love and loss of his family legend, although these things would become sentimental to him in later years. He became prone to outbursts of anger, only tempered by his newfound passion for the sea and for riding horseback, which did help with his disability. It was in Aberdeen, too, that Byron's ravenous romantic nature awakened. He began developing fiery infatuations on both boys and girls, and in 1798, the biggest puzzle piece in his lavish backstory came into place. He inherited the title of Lord from his great-uncle. When roll call in school came around shortly after and he was called his new name, George Dominus de Byron, his classmates whooped and hollered, reducing the emotional young boy to tears. Once ridiculed and maligned for his disability and family shame, he now was considered an aristocrat, and with that came a major shift in how people treated him. He would waste no time trying to live up to his title in new and extravagant ways. But first, he and his mother would need to journey south to claim his inheritance at Newstead Abbey, here in Nottinghamshire. The beauty and grandeur of Newstead, as you can imagine just by looking at it, greatly bolstered Byron's pride and ego, his hunger for his magnificent ancestry. I mean, shit, if I had inherited this thing, I'd become really annoying too. But unfortunately, in Byron's day, it was not nearly as well kept as it is today. The previous Lord Byron had been financially strapped and let the place fall into shambles. It would be a big job to bring it to its former glory, hardly a job for a 9-year-old with troublesome mood swings. When I visited Newstead Abbey a couple weeks ago during my trip to the UK, I was lucky enough to explore the place basically by myself and with my mom because it was a rainy day in the middle of the week and basically no one was there. So I had a lot of chances to talk with the staff there and get some really in-depth answers to a lot of things Byron. Also, side note, they are really into Lord Byron, obviously, and this month is the 200th anniversary of his death, so they had a lot of really hilarious Byron events going on. One of my favorite stories that someone told me there was this part near the chapel. This little room was originally used by the medieval abbey as a place to store the bodies of the dead priests and monks before going to burial, and it was a place where the body could sit while people filed past or walked in to pay their respects. Well, when Byron took control of the place, he had it turned into a swimming pool. So I really think that kind of sums up Byron's nature in general in a rather symbolic way. Fiona McCarthy continues, there was something in his perverse nature that preferred the flawed inheritance, the ruined noble abbey, a romantic liability outdoing his mother's own abandoned castle of Geit. The process began in his first published book of poetry, Hours of Idleness of 1807. Throw thy battlements, Newstead, the hollow winds whistle, thou, the hall of my fathers, art gone to decay. Unfortunately, the abbey was in such disrepair and so lonely that Byron couldn't live there for long, so he moved with his nurse, May Gray, to Nottingham, where she continued her already established habits of abusing him both physically and emotionally. Sad to say, the abuse was also sexual and persisted for 2 years. Byron was still, may I remind you, only 9 years old at this point. Many of his close friends, and even Byron himself, attribute this period of abuse to some of Byron's troubled issues with sexuality and his admittedly limited attraction to women. He conquered the hearts of many, many women over his lifetime, but he would also continually joke that all of his romances with women had a 3-month maximum time limit. And furthermore, it didn't take much for him to suddenly be disgusted by them. On the other hand, when he developed fixations on men, they would grow slowly intense over time. It's not too much unlike friend of the channel, Hans Christian Andersen. Actually, now that I think of it, those two have a lot in common. Regardless, she was dismissed as soon as word got out. Thank God, because she was a huge piece of shit. Never in one place for long, Byron was transferred to Harrow School near London. Here he found himself facing mixed vibes. On one hand, he was putting up with a lot of abuse from his teachers and his peers, who tormented him over his deformed foot. This caused Byron to be permanently fighting and lashing out, ever ready to throw a punch. On the other hand, he landed his first boyfriend, the Duke of Dorset, among other boyfriends, and romantic friendships and such. At last, in the all-male environment of Harrow's school, Byron had the opportunity to explore his developing sexuality in a deeper way. This didn't stop him from becoming fixated on women too, of course. And as usual, it always was one of his cousins. It seems like every time he came into contact with a young female cousin of his, he would be like, "Yep, she's the one," for a couple months before recovering, and he spent a summer obsessed with his cousin Mary Chaworth, while also becoming hopelessly attracted to a man named Lord Grey de Ruthin, a 23-year-old tenant at Newstead. Byron, in this year of 1803, was 15 years old. It's hard to parse out the details of what went on between these two, but many Byron scholars tend to agree that the relationship was intimate, and it's possible that Grey made sexual advances at Byron and was rejected. Byron actually broke things off after the whirlwind affair, writing in his letters that he was pissed off about something, but later letters between Byron and Grey seem as though they patched things up. Thing is, this is still a period of Byron's life when he wasn't wholly comfortable yet with the physical side of his attraction to men. After all, may I remind you, he was only 15 years old. So Grey is the freak here. And it's extremely sad that Byron was groomed by two adults in his life, May Grey and Lord Grey. No relation between the two. So it's no wonder that he had issues trying to make sense of sexuality towards either men or women, on top of the fact that in England at this time, buggery laws were a big deal, and sodomy conviction could get you publicly humiliated and stoned, or worse, executed. There was a lot to be worried about, but nevertheless, Byron left his Newstead affair behind him and returned to Harrow School, where he stoked a passionate attachment to John Fitzgibbon, the Earl of Clare. This relationship, though unofficial, of course, would be one of his longest, lasting in his heart until his death. English all-boys boarding school life for hundreds of years had its own insular homosocial and homoromantic culture that encouraged each generation to keep the depth of homosexual life within its walls a great secret. This environment was inflamed by the emphasis on the study of Greek classics, which, of course, are filled to the brim with homoerotic themes and references to the love between men. You can see a good example of the impact this environment had in works like E.M. Forster's Maurice, where study of Greek literature acts as a sexual awakening for the students at Cambridge, coincidentally the school that Byron went to as well, inspiring one character, Clive Durham, to even make a pilgrimage to Greece in hopes that it will give him answers. Byron once wrote to a friend, John Tattersall, "You say you shall miss me most damnably. I do not doubt it, for who will you have to comfort you under afflictions, and, now for sinking into poetry, to undress you when you go to bed, who to go bathe with you, in short, who to do everything with you." It's hard to say just how much his childhood infatuation with ancient Greece as a model reference for homoerotic love would go on to impact his later life quest to fight in the Greek War of Independence, but if you ask me, I think it's not connected. You know? Things started getting messy pretty much instantly following graduation from Harrow School. Some historians believe that he may have fathered an illegitimate son. He also started beefing with his mother, who was admittedly a difficult person. Luckily, he didn't have much time to spare to really cause issues before going to attend Trinity College at Cambridge in 1805. And by cause issues, I mean that, subjectively, because soon after joining Cambridge, of course, he, at 18 years old, set his sights on a 15-year-old choir boy named John Edelston, who became one of Byron's great loves. At the very least, the relationship, though fiery, seemed to be exclusively romantic, so there's that. He did simultaneously have a close group of friends, one of whom he was verifiably gay with. He also had a pet bear, because the rules said he couldn't keep a dog, so he, found a loophole. But other than that, his university years seem to have been fairly uneventful, other than the bear and the fact that he had gotten in the habit of spending exorbitant amounts of money, a habit which would continue in his post-college years as well, as he became fond of, well, bacchanalia. He had managed to put together a sort of harem of women that he fooled around with, but was not really romantic with. Robert Dallas wrote, "Unaccustomed to female society, he had once dreaded and abhorred it, and spoke of women, such I mean as he neither dreaded nor abhorred, more as playthings than companions." Notably, when one of his female companions, Caroline Cameron, began to get closer to him, so much that they lived together, he made her dress in boys' clothes and called her his brother Gordon. He hopped from relationship to relationship, often dabbling in more than one at once, and never exclusively. Of course, this makes sense. It's not like he lived in a time with modern constructs of relationship labels and courting practices. Byron was under no social pressure to choose one person and stay put, or define himself as polyamorous. It just wasn't really a way that people thought about these things. He was simply seen as a raucous king of infidelity, well known and understood to be romantically flighty. This lifestyle was clearly at odds with his interest in politics. Being politically involved would mean many more eyes on his personal life, not to mention the fact that he erred towards radical politics. So rather than focus on that, because politics was starting to bring up drama, Byron was like, "No, I'm an unbothered king and there's a whole world out there to see." So he packed his bags and set off for a grand adventure through the Mediterranean. What could possibly go wrong? Byron traveled with his buddy John Cam Hobhouse, which was probably the best pairing that there could have been, all things considered, because in all likelihood, Hobhouse was possibly some flavor of asexual, so he acted like a balancing foil for Byron's hypersexual tendencies. They're like Regency era all or nothing. Unfortunately for our traveling pals though, this cute little thing called the Napoleonic Wars was going on simultaneously, so you can picture these two bouncing around trying to avoid all the armies buzzing about and making transport perilous. But the thrill of adventure made sure that Byron was never discouraged. He got food poisoning and bug bites, but there's oranges in Lisbon and he loves oranges, so we're having a great time. Forget the hordes of British soldiers and thieves flooding Lisbon. We've got oranges! The duo made their way east through tiny villages drunk on discovery, and finally, of course, they entered Greece and things seemed to come full circle for Byron. One day he shot and killed an eagle on accident, and he swore to the Hellenic gods that he would never kill a bird again. Upon traversing the mountains of friend of the channel Delphi, he spotted a flock of a half a dozen or so eagles, and he took this as a sign from Apollo that he may become a famous poet. They stayed in Athens for 10 weeks and had a grand old time. To Byron's credit, one of his strongest social stances is one that I think today many would agree with. He personally witnessed ancient Greek marble blocks being stolen from Greek ruins and loaded onto British ships, in particular by Lord Elgin, who was responsible for the famous Elgin marbles being still held captive by the British Museum today. And Byron was vehemently against this enterprise, and at British imperialist theft at large. He said, "When they carry away 3 or 4 shiploads of the most valuable and massy relics that time and barbarism have left to the most injured and most celebrated of cities, when they destroy in a vain attempt to tear down those works which have been the admiration of ages, I know no motive which can excuse, no name which can designate the perpetration of this dastardly devastation." I'm sorry, once in a while Byron takes a break from being kind of a weirdo and whips a banger out of his back pocket, and what am I gonna do, boo at him still? He's right! I mean, he's still a little bit of a hypocrite though, because during his stay in Greece he did deface ancient relics several times. He basically scratched into things with a like "Byron was here" type graffiti. So yeah, don't get too excited about Byron's one cool opinion, because shortly after this, he also tried and failed to literally buy the 2 teenage daughters of his Greek landlady. After a brief jaunt to Constantinople, Byron returned to Athens and Ace King Hobhouse dipped back home. He might have been sick of him by this point. I would be too. He was replaced by the Marquis of Sligo, a dastardly sort of scoundrel that Byron knew from Cambridge. He also picked up a new young boyfriend named Eustathius, who was great and all, except he had seizures during sex, which is so inconvenient. Byron's sentiment, not mine. So that didn't last long. And then Byron had the gall to get offended when an actual adult man propositioned him because the guy had a long beard and was openly gay in public. Well, traveling for so long, of course, one must get sick once or twice, and Byron came down with Patras fever, which he was super excited about because he was positive that being sick made him look mysteriously sexy. So yeah, that's Byron's first foray into the world outside of merry England, but he had to return home eventually, and his return to England also kicked off his superstardom, or Byromania, which followed the publishing of his book, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a collection of his poetry from his travels. The joy of his publishing success was marred by the sudden deaths of his mother and his friend Charles Skinner Matthews. Shortly after this, his former lover, John Edelstone, died too. As his literary success boomed, Byron found himself entrenched in misery and prone to, well, bad cope. The popularity of Childe Harold climbed on, wholly unavoidable everywhere one went, in 1812. Tom Moore wrote of his newfound celebrity status. The effect was accordingly electric. His fame had not to wait for any of the ordinary gradations, but seemed to spring up, like the palace of a fairy tale in the night. With great fame came even greater chaos in Byron's love life. Several brief relationships with high society women, including a near elopement, caused him to oscillate violently between euphoria and deep depression. To make matters worse, living beyond his means had finally caught up to him. Byron, despite Childe Harold's success, was in a huge well of debt, and was trying only partially successfully to sell Newstead Abbey. To make matters worse, his ex-girlfriend, Lady Caroline Lamb, was now stalking him and making threats to go public about his homosexual leanings. Of course, that didn't stop Byron from creating an even worse scandal all by himself. His long-lived interest in his own very much married with kids half-sister Augusta had begun to reignite, and in 1813 to 1814, he started making advancements to further their relationship, and so, much to the shock and horror of polite society, as well as pretty much everyone else,
basically, Lord George Byron had fucked his sister.
Scholars argue back and forth a lot as to why this happened. In his writings, Byron was obviously heavily conflicted about the whole thing and beat himself up over it, while simultaneously admitting that he cannot remove his passions. Some believe that he fell so hard for Augusta because she was naturally so close to him and easily accessible, and also shared a similar temperament with him. It's also almost certain that he confessed to her about being attracted to men, and he alludes in his writing that she accepted this and all of his faults. So, in Augusta, he found immense understanding and comfort. It's just, well, unfortunately, they also have the same fucking dad, so.
You fucked your sister. Half-sister, by the way.
Either way, there's also eternal argument over who the real father was when Augusta gave birth to a daughter in 1814, 9 months after meeting Byron in London. Is it Byron's child or Augusta's husband's? No one will ever know for certain, but the daughter, Medora, would later in life firmly claim Byron as her father. Who's to say? Either way, the whole incest thing was understandably not steering his celebrity star in a favorable direction. This, combined with his strong and unpopular opinions, were earning him an ever-growing group of antis. His life spiraled into chaos, and issues with Newstead continued to grow. It became apparent that the only thing he could logically do was get married. He proposed to Annabella Milbank, a woman that he wasn't even interested in, and she accepted. Annabella was like a smart woman, but she also suffered from I can fix him disease. She was positive that she could heal Byron from his rakish and uncouth ways. They were married at Seaham Hall on January 2nd, 1815, amidst a great deal of apprehension from pretty much everyone. The family, the friends, even the couple themselves. Nevertheless, it went through, and as soon as the honeymoon began, things descended into madness. They consummated the marriage on a sofa, and then in the middle of the night, Byron woke up screaming, "Good God! I am surely in hell!" Byron started attempting to self-sabotage the marriage, telling Annabella about the insanity of his ancestors, alluding to his history of sodomy, hinting at the true nature of his relationship with Augusta. He had fits of panic, drank heavily, and became downright cruel, even more so after paying visits to Augusta and quickly discovering that she no longer would sleep with him now that he was married. Didn't stop her from sleeping with him when she was already married, though? I don't know. Despite it all, Annabella stayed with him, ever suffering. To her credit, I think she handled it about as well as anyone would in that situation. When Annabella became pregnant, Byron promptly became disgusted by her, and as she went into labor, he asked her if she even wanted to live with him, and then fucked off to go to the theater. Their daughter was born on December 10th, 1815, and was named Augusta Ada for God knows what reason. Ada Byron, who later was known as Ada Lovelace, would go on to earn legend status in her own right. She was schooled in math and sciences from an early age, and went on to be a contemporary of Charles Babbage, a maths professor at Cambridge. Babbage had invented an early calculating machine, and Ada analyzed it and became widely considered the first computer programmer of sorts. She would be the first person to look at the machine and anticipate its possible use as the modern computer. Tragically, Ada Lovelace passed away from cancer at only 37 years old. With Byron's increasing volatility and aggression clearly stemming from his urge to escape marriage and return east to go be gay again, Annabella took Ada and went to stay with friends, leaving Byron to ail in his misery, all on his lonesome, watched over by Augusta. Annabella also arranged for Byron to be investigated for insanity by doctors. With her husband none the wiser, the people in their lives began to find out about Byron's behavior and started demanding that the couple go separate ways. To make matters worse, that rapscallion Lady Catherine Lamb was back at it again, still at large, trying to menace Byron by telling the streets that he's a sodomist. Which, like, given the seriousness of the consequences, I know it's not funny, but you have to admit that because Byron was such a jackass, it's kind of hilarious that he gets himself into such awful situations of his own accord, and then every single time from behind him it's like, oh my god, here comes Lady Caroline with a chair! Furthermore, as the separation proceedings loomed, Lady Caroline entered into cahoots with Annabella, telling her all of Byron's darkest secrets and fears. They would be firmly separated soon enough. But as seems common with Byron, one door closes and many more open. In the spring of 1816, he became acquainted with Claire Clairmont, who was married to William Godwin, whose first wife was the notorious Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin and Wollstonecraft had a daughter, also named Mary, who went on to be wed to the poet Percy Blythe Shelley, becoming, of course, Mary Shelley. Rumors abounded that Mary and Percy Shelley had a threesome going on with Claire Clairmont. As you can probably imagine, this was Byron's favorite genre of mess, and it certainly helped that Claire made the first moves, and she wanted in Byron's pants bad, which is really awkward because she was 17 at the time, and well, Byron got her pregnant, so you can probably guess that this did not help his reputation in the slightest, and at last, Byron was forced, one way or another, to flee England. He later wrote, "I was advised not to go to the theatres lest I should be hissed, nor to my duty in Parliament lest I should be insulted, by the way. Even on the day of my departure, my most intimate friend told me afterwards that he was under apprehension of violence from the people who might be assembled at the door of the carriage." Even his close friend Hobhouse, who notoriously underestimated the extremeness of most situations involving Byron, became concerned that someone may assassinate him. On April 25th, 1816, Byron left England in exile, headed towards Geneva. He would never see England again. With the Napoleonic Wars over, travel through Europe was much easier, but Byron's reputation by that point had superseded English borders, and he was recognized almost everywhere he went. But not everyone had abandoned him. Upon his arrival in Geneva, he discovered none other than Percy and Mary Shelley, their baby son, and a very pregnant Claire Clairmont with guess whose baby. Thus begins 3 months of legend. The Shelleys rented Maison Chapuis, and every day Byron would row across the lake to visit them, and in the evenings, Byron and the Shelleys and their friend John William Polidori would read ghost stories, which inspired Byron's grand idea. Why don't the three of them invent ghost stories of their own? But Mary Shelley's story gained the most fame of them all. Her story, originally titled Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, was, well, Frankenstein. Several years ago, when I was in New York researching J.C. Leyendecker, there was actually a Frankenstein exhibit going on at the Morgan Library and Museum, one of my favorite places in New York. They had Mary's early copy of Frankenstein with a bunch of her notes, even her early writings of it, and a fragment of Percy Shelley's skull. Now, I know what you're wondering. Did Byron and the Shelleys have an affair? Well, we're pretty sure at least. It's highly likely. Look, if I cover every single situationship that Byron had, we'd be here for like 10 years. And I'm not in the UK for that long. I'm especially not in this hotel for that long. So when the Shelleys and Claire Clairmont left Switzerland, so too did Byron take his leave, and he set off to explore Armenia and Italy. He spent a considerable amount of time in Venice, pointedly ignoring his new daughter Allegra, who Claire had given birth to. Even when she came to visit him unannounced, he showed very little interest in the baby and was generally a menace of a father. He was more occupied with writing Don Juan, which was filled with thin allusions to real people in his life, and most were, pretty unsavory. But one new love affair did make a big impression on him, even as he swore up and down that he would stop being a slut. Teresa Guiccioli, the wife of Count Alessandro Guiccioli. She and Byron would sustain a passionate affair for the next 4 years. It was at this point in the script that you could say I felt a sort of Byronic madness descending over my mind, like the drifting fog of Scotland or the shadows of Newstead Abbey. Here in the UK, I feel the ghost of Byron taunting me. All these decades, centuries later, and we're still talking about him? He still has us in a vice, and for what? What am I doing here? Just to suffer? How many of Byron's stupid romantic flings am I going to have to read about? How does he still have friends? How many times is he going to move to a new fucking city in Europe? Anyway, so he moved to Ravenna. Teresa lived with him, which was cool with her husband, because honestly he was aware of their whole thing, and I don't know, he had his own issues. Meanwhile, things were getting politically spicy in Europe again. Insurrection in Italy, in particular, affected Byron, and one day he found himself faced with Ravenna's captain, Luigi Dal Pinto, who had been shot in the street near where Byron lived. Byron jumped into action, having the man carried into his residence, where he died almost instantly. Working with a surgeon, Byron investigated the body and located the gun. The whole incident made Byron more existential than usual, but it also inflamed his already present feeling that he should get involved with the politics of war. He felt an immense shift coming in himself. His old life was well and dead, his health was in shambles, he was depressed and in exile, and having a smoking hot girlfriend wasn't really making him feel, I don't know, worthy of his own dreams and ambitions. When he turned 33, he wrote himself a miserable little epitaph, the 33rd year of an ill-spent life, which after a lingering disease of many months, sunk into a lethargy and expired January 22nd, 1821 AD. And so Byron went and moved again, this time to Pisa to hang out with his old pals, the Shelleys, and figure his life out. Mind you, this whole time, Claire Clairmont has been elsewhere in Italy, and Byron had stuck their daughter Allegra in a convent because Teresa was annoyed with her presence. Tragically, after so long in the convent, with no visits from either parent, to be fair, this was against Claire's will, Allegra had a terrible fever and passed away in April of 1822. This was yet another shift in Byron's worldview. Multiple times, Allegra had written asking her father to visit her, and he never did, always distracted by something or other. But now, as he learned of her death, he went cold with guilt, and in true Byron form, the guilt evolved into self-pity. It was the only way that he could live with himself. Things worsened that summer when Percy Shelley was caught in a mysterious boat accident and drowned. Byron was inconsolable. Shelley's body was put to rest on the beach, where he was cremated by his friends. His skull shattered to pieces, but was recovered, and his heart, which apparently had, I must say quite romantically, refused to burn, was a source of conflict. Leigh Hunt took custody of it, despite Byron's wishes that it be given to Mary. He did give it to her eventually, though, don't worry. Thus began the final chapter of Byron's short life. He made a quick trip to Genoa, where he sank his teeth into a cause harkening back to the passions of his youth. The Greek War of Independence. The Greek Revolution had begun in 1821 when a conflict erupted in Moldavia, fighting against Turkish Ottoman rule. By 1822, a lot of revolutionaries from the Italian insurrection were seeking to join the Greek cause, and Byron fancied himself one of them. Byron felt intimately connected to Greece, partially on account of his queerness, and therefore his connection to its history and classic literature, and also because the time he spent in Greece was the freest and most content he ever felt. He saw himself linked with the Greek people, and thus it made sense to do something, despite his increasingly poor health, and of course that something also involved him getting sidetracked by hot, bodacious babes. Enter Lady Blessington, who was on a European tour with her husband, and in typical Byron fashion, he saw this married woman and was like, whoa. This man was a disgraced exile, 35 years old with gray hair and loose teeth, and he was still shooting his shot with anything with legs. I would say you have to respect the audacity, but you really don't. Anyway, as a result, Lady Blessington was able to weasel a ton of juicy info out of him that she would go public with years later, so thanks for that. She's an investigative journalist diva. Simultaneously, Byron was elected to the London Greek Committee, and he began to become something of an active leader. There was just one little problem. His relationship with Signora Teresa. Of course, she was still married, and she couldn't go with him. In the end, she returned to Ravenna with her father, but the despair of being parted from Byron left her falling to pieces. Thus, Byron set off for Greece aboard the Hercules with some of his buddies and a number of English officers. He arrived at Cephalonia in summer of 1823 in high spirits and ready to chase his glory. Glory was not so easily caught, however. When he arrived, he was left largely to his own devices and decision-making because his main contact had dipped back to England, and the war itself had gotten so complicated, you would need a whole other video to get a grasp on it, and I'm not doing that. Once again, to Byron's credit, in his time in Greece here, he actually did a lot of personal work trying to aid the local refugees, handing out money and giving aid directives. He even personally housed a family that had become destitute. Unfortunately, the stress of the whole thing was starting to aggravate his tendency for having wild outbursts of rage. One incident saw him randomly freaking out at a convent and barricading himself in a room. Fiona McCarthy, in her book, theorizes that this series of outbursts and confusion were caused by a delayed concussion that he had got from being hit in the head by a branch 3 days prior, which would make sense. He wasn't faring well at all, over drinking and taking weight loss pills on top of his already poor health. As the war intensified over on Missolonghi, Byron went far above and beyond the call of duty. Well, the call of his duty. Really, in sending him to Greece, the London Greek Committee only really wanted him to be like a public relations guy mostly, but here he was, actually ready to jump into action despite his ailments. In 1824, Byron landed in Missolonghi to a very grand welcome, cementing his status as a sort of Greek national hero. They saw him as a sign that Greece would come out victorious. He did his best managing the military action and unbearable duties despite his issues, but nevertheless, his health continued to deteriorate. A few weeks after his 36th birthday, Byron wrote one of his final journal entries following a health scare. "I had a strong shock of a convulsive description, but whether epileptic, paralytic, or apoplectic is not yet decided by the 2 medical men who attend me, or whether it be of some other nature, if such there be. It was very painful, and had it lasted a moment longer, must have extinguished my mortality." In an attempt to treat him, his doctors tried bloodletting through his forehead using leeches, but they placed them right on the temporal artery, causing extreme bleeding. Nevertheless, Byron was not bedridden for too long, and in typical Byron fashion, he managed to squeeze in a couple more love affairs at the last minute. Most notably, a boy named Lucas, whom he wrote several poems about. None of it was to be, although in his final weeks he showed no signs of slowing down. He was full of optimism, ambition, and fond memories. Even so, he suffered from migraines, excessive weight loss, and a strange, foreboding feeling. Unsure what to do with himself, he insisted on exercising by going out riding in a storm. Caught in the rain, drenched and shaking, it took far too long for Byron to reach home with his page. He developed a fever and aches and began to panic, remembering that as a child, a fortune teller had warned his mother that he must beware his 37th year. Nothing the doctors did for him helped, and still, Byron insisted on writing and working. Delirium set in. Panicked, the doctors repeatedly bloodlet him, far too much, but it was no use. Slowly, Byron's spirit seemed to be leaking out. After several days of slow agony, George Gordon Byron passed away on April 19th as a thunderstorm raged outside. His page Pietro wrote to Augusta, "He died in a strange land and amongst strangers, but more loved, more wept he could not have been." There's, I suppose, a good reason why this video at this point is so goddamn long compared to some other biography videos I've done on people who lived much longer than Byron did. His impact is immeasurable. Following his death came the rise of the cult of Byron and the Byronic hero. Obviously, today, someone could refer to someone as looking Byronic, and you would know exactly what they mean. Romantic, artsy yet masculine, carefree yet still noble. The vibe he captured in his poetry, the way he presented himself. Call Byron whatever nasty names you want and I'll join you. But his greatest strength was in understanding how powerful a visual brand is. His tendency to press past and play with gender presentation, taking advantage of his innate femininity, was a power he learned how to wield in his favor. And vitally for the men who would later use him as a role model, Byron was the image of masculinity that straddled 2 seemingly separate worlds, that of the action-minded revolutionary and the prolific artist. And as much as people hated him for it, his open bisexuality was absolutely a factor that gave him such an edge. It's as perfectly romantic era as it possibly gets. Although, notably, his friends and early biographers went to great lengths to censor out the mentions of his homosexuality in his work, journals, letters, and general lore. At least, what wasn't burned in that parlor. But it is also true that Byron was an enthusiastic, lover of teenage boys, and an Orientalist. and these two issues are heavily linked, especially considering the context Byron lived in Europe. Peter Drucker writes in Byron and Ottoman Love, Orientalism, Europeanization, and Same-Sex Sexualities in the early 19th century Levant, Byron did not fully embrace the hierarchical view that saw Asian cultures as lesser, and his attitude to the Ottoman world was never one of simple rejection. Rather, it was compounded of fascination born of alienation from his own British society, strong impulses to rebel against the prejudices of his time and culture, delight at Ottoman social and sexual mores, and personal identification with the doom he felt lay ahead for both him and for the Ottomans. Like some late 18th century Europeans before him, Byron was captivated by the sensuality, promise, terror, sublimity, idyllic pleasure, and intense energy that he saw in the Levant. Byron, alienated from his British peers on account of his queerness in the wake of a sharp rise in homophobia at home, saw Greece as a paradise of sexual freedom. That homosexuality between adult men and teen boys was a common aspect of that in the Levant, heavily influenced him, encouraged by his already established Orientalism. It's a complicated issue that is really hard to reconcile with today. I highly recommend reading Drucker's paper on this topic if you want to explore further, but I simply can't do it justice as a postscript on a bio video. Obviously, check out all the sources I've listed, but the especially helpful ones are that paper, Byron, Life and Legend by Fiona McCarthy, and Lord Byron and Scandalous Celebrity by Clara Tweet. Regardless, his influence is undeniable. For decades, he became the ideal male archetype. Théophile Gautier wrote in A History of Romanticism, 1874, "At that time it was the fashion in the Romanticist school for a man to be wan, livid, greenish, and somewhat cadaverous, if possible, for thus did one attain the fateful, Byronic, jour look of one devoured by passion and remorse. Tender-hearted women thought such a one was interesting. People hated, then loved, then really hated, then really loved him. And really, what, in such a short and tumultuous life, could be more emblematic of celebrity than that? He's not an easy figure to take a heavy stance on. No wonder he worried for his own madness, the curse of his violent ancestry. I suppose Byron had a point when he argued that it's impossible to define sanity or insanity given the diverse breadth of human nature. Free expression was his one constant fighting song, even though the way that he engaged with that expression caused many people great pain, including himself. A short life, but a fabled one still, some of Byron's final writings in Don Juan seem to carry a mirror to his heart. Shut up the world at large, let Bedlam out, and you will be perhaps surprised to find all things pursue exactly the same route. As now with those of soi distant sound mind, this I could prove beyond a single doubt. Were there a jot of sense among mankind, but till that point depuis is found, alas, like Archimedes, I leave earth as 'twas. Thank you for learning with me about yet another Chaos Bisexual, yet another addition to my ever-growing series of weird, wild men of history. Have I been too nice to Byron, or too mean? I know none of you will agree. Anyway, don't forget to buy my book, Liberated, The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and do not follow Lord Byron's example.